The morning Chicago air carried that particular kind of cold that cut through cheap fabric and went straight to the bone. Glass towers caught the gray sky and threw it back in sharp reflections. Black sedans idled in front of the financial district, dropping off men and women in long coats and polished shoes. Among them, on a sidewalk that did not seem to belong to him, walked a tall man named Elias Mercer, holding the small hand of a 6-year-old girl. Elias wore a charcoal suit that had once been good. The cuffs were a little worn at the edges, and the black leather of his shoes had lost its shine at the toes, but he stood straight, broad-shouldered, calm in a way that did not match the panic gathering inside his chest. In one hand he carried a thin folder of papers. In the other, he held the warm, slightly trembling fingers of his daughter, Matilda. Matilda wore a pale blue jacket that was a size too big for her. Her brown hair was a little tangled at the ends. Pressed against her chest, she clutched a stuffed rabbit whose left ear had been sewn back on twice. She looked up at the towering Hartwell Global Logistics building, with eyes that wanted to be brave, and she squeezed the rabbit a little tighter. He had not wanted to bring her. The babysitter had canceled at 5 that morning. The neighbor he sometimes asked was already at her own job. The rent was a week past due. Matilda's asthma inhaler had only a few days left. The check engine light on his old sedan had blinked at him for 3 mornings in a row. Everything in his life had narrowed into one slim chance, and that chance lived behind the revolving doors of the building in front of him. "Daddy, are you going to get the job today?" Matilda asked. Elias bent down, so they were eye to eye. He smiled the way he had practiced smiling for her over the past 2 years, the kind of smile that hid everything she was too small to carry. "I am going to do my very best, sweetheart," he said. "That is all I can promise." She nodded, as though that was the most adult promise anyone had ever made her, and they walked through the revolving doors together. The lobby was a temple of polished marble and quiet money. The receptionist behind the long glass counter looked up, took in the man's worn cuffs, the child clutching a rabbit, and hesitated. A security guard's eyes flicked from the folder to the little girl and then back, as if calculating whether to ask the man if he was sure he had the right address. Elias offered his name as evenly as he had practiced. "Elias Mercer," he said. "I have an interview at 9:15 for the Operations Recovery Manager position." The receptionist tapped at her keyboard. Her expression shifted from doubt to mild surprise. The interview was indeed on the calendar. She handed him a visitor badge and pointed toward the elevators. High above them, on the 38th floor, a young woman in a cream bodycon dress stood with her arms crossed at the window of her new office. From there, the lobby looked like a small chessboard, and the people moving through it looked like pieces. She watched the man in the worn suit and the little girl with the rabbit cross the floor, and her brow drew tight. Callista Hartwell had been the chief executive officer of Hartwell Global Logistics for exactly 11 days. In her view, a man who could not arrange childcare for an interview was already telling her a story she had no patience to hear. She turned back to her desk and lifted the folder her assistant had left for her that morning. The top resume bore the same name, now climbing into the elevator below. She had taken the chair her father had built. Henry Hartwell had founded the company 40 years ago, out of a single warehouse and a battered truck. He had spent the last decade preparing her, sending her to business school, then to operations rotations across 3 continents. He had been everything to her teacher, her hardest critic, her quiet protector. And then, 6 months earlier, he had died. The board had not waited long before they began circling. Across the conference table, the morning before, a heavy-set man with silver hair and a suit far more expensive than her father's had ever been, had reminded Callista that the next 30 days would decide whether the board trusted her. Corbin Shaw said it the way another man might mention the weather, but everyone in the room had heard the threat under his polished phrasing. If she made one weak call, one decision that smelled of sentiment, the board could vote in supervisory measures that would leave her chief executive in title only. Callista had walked out of that room and made herself a private rule: no softness, no exceptions, no personal stories allowed inside the operating walls of Hartwell Global Logistics. If the company was going to survive her first year, she would have to be harder than any man who had ever sat in her chair. So when she opened Elias Mercer's resume that morning and saw the 2-year gap, The note about leaving a stable job to care for a sick wife, the line that listed him as a single father, she did not feel sympathy. She felt risk. A man with that much weight on his shoulders, she told herself, would not be the steady hand a recovery manager needed. She did not see, at the corner of her own desk, the small framed photograph of her father standing in a dusty warehouse in his rolled-up sleeves, his hands streaked with grease, smiling at someone outside the frame. She had inherited his company. She had not yet inherited his eye for people. Down the hall, 2 assistants escorted Elias and Matilda to the interview floor. The corridor on 38 was hushed in a way that felt rehearsed. Every surface gleamed, every footstep echoed. Halfway down, Elias bent and whispered to Matilda, "You are going to sit in a chair for a little while. I just need you to be brave for, 20 minutes. After this, we will go get pancakes. The really tall ones. Deal?" She nodded. The rabbit pressed to her cheek. Deal. The conference room door opened, and 4 people looked up at once. Amanda Pierce, the Human Resources Director, gave a polite, slightly puzzled smile. William Drake, the Chief Financial Officer, glanced at the folder in front of him and then at the small girl. Corbin Shaw allowed himself a faint, knowing curve of the lips, the kind of smile a man wears when he has just found exactly the excuse he was hoping for. Callista did not smile at all. "Mr. Mercer," she said evenly, "are you aware this interview is for an operations crisis management position?" "I am, ma'am," Elias said. "Then I am curious why you brought your daughter with you." He explained in 2 sentences. The babysitter had canceled at the last minute. He had no family in the city. His daughter would not interrupt the interview, and he would not have asked the company to accommodate him in any way. Matilda, as if to prove him right, walked quietly to a chair against the far wall. She climbed into it, sat with her feet still hanging well above the floor, and folded the rabbit into her lap. She did not fidget. She did not speak. She had decided, in the way that very young children sometimes decide entire things, that she was going to be the best little girl in the room so that her father would not look bad. It made the room quieter, not louder. Her stillness pressed against everyone present, like a question they did not want to answer. Corbin spoke first, in the voice of a man amused by his own joke. "If a candidate cannot arrange supervision for a single morning, I am not entirely sure he has the bandwidth for managing a billion-dollar operation." Amanda Pierce shifted uncomfortably. William Drake studied his folder. Neither of them spoke. Callista did not correct Corbin, and her silence was a permission slip. Elias folded his hands in his lap. He did not match the tone. He did not raise his chin in defense. He said only, "In real operations, sir, plans break. The thing that matters is what a person does when the plan breaks, not whether the plan was perfect to begin with." Callista felt that sentence land like a small, well-aimed pebble. It was a respectful answer, but it had a steel core. It was the kind of thing her father might have said. The thought irritated her, and she pushed it away. "Walk us through your background," she said. He did. He spoke about his 8 years at a regional transit hub, managing night shift operations for a federal contract carrier. He explained how he had learned to read manifests against actual dock scans, how he had built a side ledger on his own time to compare expected versus actual loss across 43 trailers, how he had once caught a software miscount that was costing the company nearly $200,000 a year in untracked phantom inventory. He explained, in plain language, how he had reduced overall shrinkage by 18% by changing the order in which trailer numbers were logged at the gate. It was not a glamorous improvement. It was the kind of fix that a man with a clipboard and a lot of nights under fluorescent lights notices. It was also, William Drake quietly registered, the exact category of small operational miss that a healthy logistics company should never overlook. Amanda asked about the gap. Elias answered without flinching and without lingering. His wife had been diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. He had stepped away from his job to care for her and for their daughter. After his wife passed, he had needed time to make sure Matilda was steady before he tried to step back into work. He did not say the word grief. He did not need to. Callista heard the word stable and chose to weaponize it. "This position requires endurance under pressure," she said. "Sustained pressure. Are you certain you are in a position to provide that?" Elias looked at her for a moment, longer than was comfortable. "Ma'am," he said, "I have lived under pressure every day for the last 3 years. The only difference is I did not have a conference room to put it in." The temperature in the room shifted. It was not insolent. It was not loud. It was simply the truth, and the truth in a quiet voice has its own kind of weight. Corbin laughed once, sharp and dry. "We do not hire candidates based on inspirational backstories, Mr. Mercer. We hire them based on fit." Matilda had been so still that the adults had nearly forgotten her. But she heard that. The word backstory did not mean anything to her, but the tone did, and her small hand curled a little tighter around the rabbit's threadbare ear. Elias did not look at her. He could not. He knew that if he met her eyes in that moment, he would not be able to keep the calm in his voice. So he turned a page in his folder instead and said, "I prepared a brief observation about your current public reporting. May I?" Callista nodded, expecting platitudes. He surprised her. He pointed out neatly that in Hartwell Global Logistics' most recent quarterly disclosures, the warehousing line had grown 3 points faster than revenue, while the per-shipment cost on certain mid-tier lanes had crept up against the trend of fuel prices. It was, he said, the kind of pattern that suggested either a vendor compounding issue or a hidden bottleneck at one of the transload points. He did not accuse anyone. He simply named the shape of the curve. William Drake's chin lifted half an inch. He was the only person in the room besides Callista who fully understood what Elias had just said, and he understood it well enough to feel uneasy. Corbin cut the conversation off before it could go further. Outside candidates do not get to speculate about internal systems based on public filings. "Of course," Elias said quietly. "I only mean that the patterns suggest there are things worth verifying." Callista closed the folder. The sound was small, but in the room it landed like a door shutting. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "Hartwell Global Logistics is not a place to retry your life. We need people who are settled, sharpened, free of personal turbulence in the executive corridor. I am sure there are positions elsewhere better suited to your circumstances." For 4 full seconds, nobody breathed. Elias did not look at Matilda, but he heard the small intake of air as she understood enough of the words to feel them. He felt his pulse move up into his throat. He felt the worn fabric of his cuff against his wrist. He felt every dollar he did not have, and every appointment he had skipped to be there. And then, because he had a daughter watching, he chose what he had been choosing for 3 years. He kept his dignity. Corbin smirked. Perhaps something with a less demanding schedule, where bringing the child along would not be a concern. Amanda turned her face toward the window. William stared at the surface of the table. Neither of them spoke. The silence of people who could have intervened weighed more than any insult. Elias stood up. He did not lift his chin in defiance. He simply gathered his folder, smoothed his cuff once with his thumb, and said, "Thank you for your time." He turned toward Matilda and held out his hand. She slid out of the chair very slowly, the way a child moves when she believes she has just broken something important. She took his hand, and they walked out together. For a single beat as they passed the doorway, Matilda glanced back. She did not look at her father. She looked at Callista. The glance was not angry. It was small and embarrassed, the way a child looks when she has been told she is the reason for something bad. Callista felt that look land somewhere she had been keeping locked, and she pushed it down. The door closed. Corbin chuckled. "And that, Callista, is exactly why we maintain our standards." Callista did not answer. She slid the resume to the side and signed her initials at the top of the rejection slip. The small motion of her pen was the largest mistake she would ever make. Out in the hallway, Elias walked slowly because Matilda was walking slowly. The corridor felt longer on the way out than it had on the way in. The white light reflected on the polished floor made everything look like it was floating. He could feel her grip in his hand growing tighter, and he could feel the silence in her body. She was a 6-year-old girl trying very hard not to cry in a place where crying was forbidden. They reached the end of the hallway, where the elevators waited. Matilda stopped. She did not look up. Her voice, when it came, was so small that he had to lean down to hear it. "Daddy," she said, "is it because I came with you that you did not get the job?" Elias did not answer for a moment. He could not. He set the folder on the floor beside him, so he could lower himself fully onto one knee in front of her. He took both of her shoulders gently in his big, work-shaped hands. "Matilda," he said, "look at me, sweetheart." She looked up. Her eyes were full and bright, but no tears had yet spilled. She was holding them in for him. "You are not the reason I lost anything today," he said. "Do you hear me? You are the reason I will never give up. Not now, not ever." She blinked. "Then why did they laugh at you?" He breathed in, slowly. He thought about how to answer that without putting hate into a 6-year-old's heart, and he thought about how to answer it without lying. Both mattered to him. "Because some people," he said, "only see the old jacket and the old shoes and the little girl standing next to her dad, and they do not see what that dad has walked through to still be standing here at all." The elevator dinged behind them. The doors slid open. 2 executives stepped out and saw a man kneeling on the floor in front of his daughter, and they slowed their walk without meaning to. They did not know what had happened. They only knew that they had walked into something private. Matilda looked at the rabbit, then at her father. She held the rabbit up between them. "Daddy," she said, "you can hold him for a minute, so you do not feel so sad." Elias laughed once, very softly, the way a man laughs to keep from breaking. He took the rabbit, held it gently against his chest for 3 full breaths, and then handed it back to her. "I am okay, baby. I have got everything I need right here." He picked up the folder, took her hand again, and they stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, he caught his own reflection in the polished metal. A tired man, a small girl, a chance that had just shut behind them. He did not yet know that on the floor above, a different door was about to open. In the conference room they had just left, Audrey Lane, Callista's assistant, slipped through the side door and approached her with the kind of measured energy assistance reserved for moments that cannot be postponed. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "Constance Hale is in the executive room. She says the final clause of your father's will requires you. Today." Callista lifted her eyes, irritated. "Today?" She was very specific. "Within the same business day as your first hiring decision." Corbin's head turned, sharply. He had not known about that timing. Callista rose, smoothed her dress, and followed Audrey down the hall. She was already mentally labeling the meeting as a formality, a final piece of paperwork from a sentimental old man who had wanted his daughter to feel the weight of his transition one more time. She had no interest in feeling it. In the executive conference room, Constance Hale waited beside a polished leather case that had belonged to Henry Hartwell for 35 years. She was a small, silver-haired woman with the calm of a person who had stood beside a great many wills in her career and was no longer rattled by anyone's wealth. 2 senior board members had also been called in. William Drake, still pale from the previous meeting, took a seat. Corbin Shaw arrived last, his polish slightly less convincing than usual. Constance laid out the documents in a precise pattern. She removed a sealed envelope from the inside flap of the leather case. "Your father instructed me," she said, looking only at Callista, "that this final clause was to be opened only after you had officially taken your seat as Chief Executive Officer and made your first independent hiring decision of the day." Callista's stomach turned over once, neatly. Constance broke the seal. "The full operational authority of Callista Hartwell, as Chief Executive Officer of Hartwell Global Logistics," she read, "shall take effect only upon her appointment of Elias Mercer to the position of Special Operations Trustee for a term of 6 months, with independent authority to review all systems of operations, procurement, warehousing, and shipment within the company." The temperature of the room dropped. William's eyes went wide. Corbin made a small, involuntary sound, almost a cough. Callista did not move. The folder on her desk 1 floor away, the resume she had just signed off on, the man whose dignity she had taken from him in front of his child, they all rearranged themselves in her mind into a single, towering mistake. "Constance," she said, slowly, "I would like you to read that name again." "Elias Mercer," Constance said, without inflection. "Date of birth, prior employment, and reference details are attached. Your father included a personal letter." Corbin found his voice first, too quickly. "This is not workable. We cannot allow an outside individual, particularly one who has just been declined for an unrelated role, to step into a position with that level of authority. The clause is unreasonable. Constance turned her gaze on him with the patient curiosity of someone watching a man dig his own grave with a dessert spoon. Mr. Shaw, the clause has been validated by 3 separate counsel and registered with the board's own bylaws. If the executive will not appoint Mr. Mercer within the prescribed window, controlling voting rights revert to a trust under my supervision until the clause is satisfied. Callista heard her own breath. She heard Corbin's panic, sharper than the lawyer's calm. She heard, far back in her mind, her father's voice from long ago saying something she had not understood at the time. The loudest man in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. For the first time since her father's funeral, she allowed herself to ask, in earnest, what had he seen that she had missed? Constance reached into the case and drew out a second, smaller envelope. Your father wrote to you, she said. He intended for you to read it before you spoke to Mr. Mercer. But circumstances appear to have moved faster than he expected. She handed it across the table. Callista opened it with steady hands and shaking lungs. Henry Hartwell's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted and forceful, the way it had been on every birthday card he had ever given her. The letter began with an apology. Henry wrote that he had not wanted to leave his daughter with a riddle. He had wanted to leave her with a guard. Years ago, he wrote, he had come to suspect that something inside Hartwell Global Logistics was deeply wrong. The numbers were too clean. Real operations were never clean, he wrote, the way a real life was never clean. Somewhere in the company, money was moving through patterns that had been polished smooth on purpose. He had begun gathering his own evidence in a leather satchel he carried personally, away from his secretary, away from his most senior officers. One rainy night, after a surprise visit to a satellite warehouse, he had left that satchel behind. He had not noticed until he was already 2 hours away. The man who found it had not been an executive. He had not been the warehouse manager. He had been the third-shift supervisor, a young man named Elias Mercer. Callista's eyes lifted from the paper for 1 second. She made herself look back down. Inside the satchel, Henry wrote, were contracts, vendor lists, blank countersigned checks, and financial documents that, in the wrong hands, would have been worth a great deal of money to a great many people. Within hours of finding it, Elias had been approached. A man neither Hinathra Henry had ever seen before had offered him $50,000 in cash to deliver the satchel to a particular address and forget the night had ever happened. At the time, Henry wrote, Elias's wife was beginning her second round of treatment. The bills were already past what insurance would cover. Their daughter was 3 years old. By any reasonable measure, $50,000 would have been a lifeline. He had refused. He had spent 2 days locating Henry personally, refusing to speak with anyone else, refusing to leave the satchel with anyone but the man whose name was on it. When he finally placed it back in Henry's hands, intact, Henry had asked him why. Henry quoted Elias's answer in the letter, word for word, because he had never forgotten it. Because, sir, Elias had said, if I sell the truth while my daughter is still small, one day I will not know how to teach her what an honest man looks like. Callista's hand tightened on the paper. Henry had tried to give him a reward. Elias had refused. He had asked only one thing. If the documents could be used to protect the people inside the company who were doing honest work, then Henry should use them. Otherwise, Elias would rather they had stayed in the satchel. He is the only outsider I have ever fully trusted with the truth of this company, Henry's letter continued. And he is the only person I trust to walk these warehouses and these accounts the way I would have if I had been given more time. Constance let her finish reading. Across the table, Corbin had stopped speaking. He had also, Callista noticed, stopped looking at her. He was studying the corner of the table. Callista lifted her head. She felt the precise, vertiginous sensation of a worldview shifting on its hinges. My father, she said carefully, did not put this clause in his will to repay an old debt. No, Constance said, he did not. He put it there because he believes the network is still operating. He believed, Constance said, that whoever paid $50,000 for that satchel did not pay it alone, and that the people who set up the offer would not have left a system half-built. For the first time, Callista turned her head and looked directly at Corbin Shaw. He did not meet her eyes. In the lobby, far below them, Elias and Matilda were walking past the front desk toward the revolving doors. He had not spoken since they left the elevator. Matilda had not spoken since the rabbit moment. The receptionist watched them go with a slightly pained expression, the kind of expression people get when they want to say something kind, but cannot find the right shape for it. The security guard reached for the door panel out of habit. Behind them, the elevator chimed. Heels on marble. Quick. Uneven. Mr. Mercer, a voice said. Please. Wait. Elias turned slowly. Callista Hartwell crossed the lobby with the letter still in her hand, her cream dress catching the gray light from the windows. Behind her, several paces back, came William Drake, Constance Hale, and a noticeably pale Corbin Shaw. Audrey Lane lingered near the elevators with her hand pressed to her mouth. Every employee in the lobby stopped pretending not to look. The receptionist set down her phone. 2 delivery people froze near the side door. A man in a suit with a coffee cup forgot to keep walking. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to happen in front of an audience. Callista stopped 3 feet from Elias. She did not start with company language. She did not start with corporate words. I was wrong, she said. The lobby seemed to lean in. I judged you on a worn jacket, on a calendar problem, on the fact that your daughter was in the room. I judged you instead of listening to you. I made my first decision as chief executive officer of this company by doing the exact thing my father spent 40 years teaching me not to do. I am sorry. Elias looked at her for a long moment. He did not soften. He did not snap. He looked at her the way a tired man looks at a sudden weather change, deciding whether or not to trust it. Are you apologizing because you realized you were wrong? He asked. Or because you found my name in your father's will? The lobby went so quiet that the hiss of the heating vent became audible. Callista did not flinch. She had decided, in the elevator on the way down, that if he asked her this, she would not lie. That decision was the first executive choice of her career that she could stand on without help. Both, she said. I came down here because of the will, but I am apologizing because I read his letter, and I realized I hurt a man who did not deserve it, in front of his child. On the morning, he came here trusting that we would treat him fairly. There is no version of that I am proud of. Elias glanced down at Matilda. She was holding the rabbit so tightly its sewn ear had folded in half. She was looking up at him, waiting to see what kind of man her father chose to be in this moment, because she had already learned, quietly, over 6 small years, that her father's choices were how she learned what people were supposed to do. Elias spoke clearly enough for the lobby to hear. Miss Hartwell, he said, I do need a job. I have rent, I have a 6-year-old who needs medicine, and I have not had a steady paycheck in 2 years. But my daughter needs to see her father respected more than she needs to see him paid. A breath went through the room, as if a window had been opened. Callista took 1 step forward, and then, surprising even herself, knelt down so she was level with Matilda. The cream fabric of her dress pooled on the marble. The rabbit's good ear twitched slightly as Matilda hugged it closer. Sweetheart, Callista said, in a voice quite different from the one she had used upstairs. I owe you an apology too. You came into our building this morning, and you sat in that chair like a good, brave girl, and I made you feel like you were the reason something bad was happening. You were not even a little. Your daddy is one of the best people I have ever read about, and that is the truth. The person who got it wrong this morning was me. Matilda's mouth trembled. She thought hard for a second, the way only 6-year-olds can think hard. Then she asked, very carefully, So, my daddy did not do anything bad? No, honey, Callista said. Your daddy did not do anything bad. The grown-up who got it wrong was me. Matilda nodded once, slowly, as if she were filing that answer in a place she would need to revisit for years. Callista rose. She turned back to Elias. She said, in a voice still meant for the room, I would like to formally invite you to take the position of Special Operations Trustee at Hartwell Global Logistics. The full terms will be in writing, with full and independent authority, under no influence of mine or of this board. If you say no, that is your right, and we will not contest it. Elias took several seconds to answer. I will accept, he said, on 3 conditions. The authority is real, in writing, and not symbolic. No member of this board interferes with my access to operational data, And if I find what I expect to find, I will follow it where it goes, not where it is comfortable. Callista did not even look at Corbin Shaw before she answered. Agreed. The next 6 months changed the company. They did not change it loudly. Elias did not arrive on his first day in a different suit. He wore the same charcoal jacket, freshly pressed at a corner cleaner, and a pair of clean steel-toed boots. He set up in a small office that nobody on the executive floor wanted because it was too close to the freight elevators. He liked it for exactly that reason. He started where men in better suits never started. He went to the loading docks. He sat with the night shift dispatchers. He drank bad coffee with the truck drivers at 4 in the morning. He listened to the warehouse managers complain about the things they had been told for years not to bother executive ears with. He learned the names of forklift operators. He learned which gates were always over schedule and which lanes always somehow ran lighter than the manifests claimed. Some of the senior managers called him, behind their hands, the will hire. Some of them rolled their eyes when he asked for raw scan data instead of summary dashboards. Corbin Shaw, in particular, found ways to slow him down. Files arrived late. Permissions were misrouted. Reports that should have been 1 page came back as 40. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not write angry messages. He ran his own numbers at home, often with Matilda asleep on the couch beside him, the rabbit tucked under her arm. Slowly, a shape began to emerge. Certain mid-tier shipping lanes had fuel costs that simply did not match the routes they claimed to use. Some warehouse codes appeared twice in the system, registered to vendors with different names but identical mailing addresses in 3 different states. Storage fees on weekends were being charged for inventory that, according to gate scan data, had already left the building before close of business on Friday. Each of these things, alone, was small enough to hide. Together, they formed a pattern, as deliberate as a constellation. He pulled threads. The mailing addresses traced to a cluster of small shell companies. The shell companies routed payments through a single intermediary that, when he opened the corporate filings, listed an officer who had, 10 years earlier, been an aide to Corbin Shaw. He did not run to the boardroom. He went deeper. He spent a long evening with an older trucker who had driven for the company since the founding decade. The driver, after a long pull on his coffee, told Elias about the ghost loads, trips that appeared on the system, trips that had never come through the gate. The driver had reported them once, 10 years ago. He had been told, very politely, never to bring it up again. Elias also spoke with a young warehouse clerk who had once flagged a duplicate vendor code and been transferred to a different shift the following week. She still had the letter she had sent. She had kept it in a personal folder, carefully labeled, in case she ever needed it. By the time Elias requested time before the full board, he had built a presentation so quiet and so careful that no individual page accused anyone. He simply laid the data down, 1 piece at a time, and let the data do the talking. On a gray afternoon in the same conference room where he had first been told he was not good enough for the company, Elias walked the board through what he had found. He named the duplicate vendors. He showed the mismatched fuel costs. He laid out the Friday to Monday warehouse fee charges on inventory that did not exist. He brought up the intermediary company. He highlighted the chain of approvals. The final approval signature on 3 separate questionable contracts traced back, by login record, to 1 man. Corbin Shaw made one attempt to deflect. He mentioned legacy systems. He mentioned bookkeeping artifacts from the founder era. He suggested that an outside reviewer could not be expected to understand the historical complexity of the company. Elias did not respond directly. He simply pulled up the final page. It was a single screen capture of a system access log, showing Corbin Shaw's credentials approving a transfer at 2:17 in the morning, on a date when, according to his executive calendar, he had been at a charity dinner with public photographs. The room did not need a verdict announced. William Drake leaned back in his chair, slowly, and put one hand over his mouth. Amanda Pierce looked, for a full 10 seconds, as though she were doing arithmetic about how many times she had stayed silent. The rest of the board exchanged the kind of looks that mean a vote has already been taken without anyone speaking. Callista stood up. She did not gloat. She did not perform. She said, in an even voice, "Mr. Mercer was not appointed to this position because my father felt sorry for him. He was appointed because he has three things this company nearly lost: real competence, real honesty, and real self-respect. My father saw it. I did not. I am asking the board to act on what we have seen today, in full, without exceptions, no matter how senior the names. Corbin Shaw was suspended that evening, pending formal investigation. Within the month, 2 shell vendors had been frozen, 3 external partners had distanced themselves, and the company had begun a top-to-bottom restructuring of its procurement controls. The losses, fully calculated, came to nearly $17 million over 6 years. The company did not collapse. The company grew straighter. On a Friday afternoon in late spring, Elias walked out of the Hartwell Global Logistics building under a bright sky. The revolving door turned behind him. Matilda, who had been waiting in the small reception area with Audrey Lane, reading a picture book to her, ran across the lobby and threw herself into his legs. "Daddy," she said, looking up, "did you really get the job for real this time?" He picked her up and settled her on his hip. She was almost too big for it, but neither of them cared. He pressed his forehead against hers for one beat. "For real this time, baby." She held the rabbit up between their faces, as if to share the news with him too. Across the lobby, Callista Hartwell stood with her arms folded and her shoulders softer than they had been a year before. She did not approach. She only watched, the way her father had once watched a young night shift supervisor walk away with a satchel full of truth he could not be paid to forget. On her desk, upstairs, the framed photograph of Henry Hartwell in his grease-streaked sleeves now sat next to a folded letter she had read so many times the creases had grown soft. Beside the letter, a small handwritten note in her own steady script read simply, "Never measure a man by the suit he can afford. Measure him by what he refused to sell." Henry Hartwell had not put Elias Mercer's name in his will to repay a poor man. He had left that name there as the last lesson he ever gave his daughter. Never look down on a father who is silently bearing too much, because sometimes that is the only person honest enough to save an entire empire.